So when you hear the phrase, a 600-year history of a medieval religious order, there's this immediate expectation of, well, dust.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
It sounds completely static, like an institution just trapped in amber.
Exactly. You just
Hmm.
mentally prepare yourself for dry dates, endless lists of priors, and, the kind of academic prose that essentially functions as a cure for insomnia.
Which is how we tend to view medieval history anyway, right?
Yeah.
As
Yeah.
this monolithic, unchanging block of time where everyone just sat around in monasteries waiting for the Renaissance.
But then you open William A. Hinnebusch's text, The Dominicans: A Short History, and that dusty archive illusion just shatters instantly.
Oh, completely.
Because what we're actually looking at here is a sweeping, visceral case study
Yeah.
in organizational survival. This is the story of a medieval global think tank, violently struggling to maintain a core identity through, bubonic plagues, papal schisms, and massive political revolutions.
It's wild.
It really is. So welcome to today's deep dive. It is Saturday, June 20th, 2026, and a very special welcome to you, the learner, joining us today. Our mission is to extract the most fascinating and relevant insights from Hinnebusch's comprehensive historical text.
Right, and to give you some initial framing, Saint Dominic founded the Order of Preachers in the early 13th century.
The Dominicans.
Exactly. And what makes their history such a compelling read today is that it serves as a perfect mirror for anyone interested in how massive multinational organizations scale, how they catastrophically fail, and, well, how they attempt to reform themselves over centuries.
Yeah, it's really a masterclass in institutional dynamics.
We like to think that modern tech giants or multinational corporations invented the concept of scaling up or, pivoting a business model or managing a global workforce. But the Dominicans were dealing with all of those exact same structural headaches centuries ago.
Okay, let's unpack this. To understand how the Dominicans scaled so massively, we have to start at the genesis. We need to look at the unique startup problem that St. Dominic was actually trying to solve.
And Dominic was, by all accounts, just a fascinating individual to study. He was born in Spain in the late 12th century, highly educated, and possessed this really intense personal zeal.
Right.
He wasn't just a theorist. He was deeply affected by the physical realities of his time.
Yeah, there's this incredible anecdote from his early days that I think sets the stage for his entire character. He was studying in Palencia, and a severe famine hit the region. People were literally starving in the streets. And Dominic didn't just, give away his spare change. He actually sold his own books to feed the poor.
It's huge.
We have to remember, in the Middle Ages, books weren't mass-produced paperbacks. They were hand-copied on parchment. They were incredibly rare and phenomenally expensive.
Yeah, selling your personal library back then was the equivalent of a modern college student selling their sports car to fund a local soup kitchen.
Exactly. It's an extreme move.
It showed a radical detachment from material goods in favor of immediate human need. He prioritized action over possession. But the real turning point for him, the moment his organizational business model started to take shape, happened a bit later.
Right, the innkeeper.
Yeah, he was traveling through southern France with his bishop, and they stopped for the night at a local inn.
And in a twist of fate, the innkeeper turns out to be an Albigensian heretic.
Right. And the Albigenses, also known as the Cathars, they weren't just a minor fringe group. They were a massive, deeply entrenched movement at the time.
They had a lot of influence.
They did. They believed in a strict dualism, that the physical world was inherently evil and only the spiritual world was good. So Dominic stays up the entire night arguing theology with this innkeeper.
Just going at it.
Hour after hour of intense logical debate. And by sunrise, the innkeeper actually renounces his heresy and returns to the Catholic faith.
That all-night debate sparked a massive realization for Dominic. He looked around and saw this glaring market gap for the church.
Oh, a massive gap.
The local clergy, the parish priests, were largely ignorant and lazy. They rarely preached, and when they did, they weren't exactly inspiring.
No, not at all.
Meanwhile, the heretic leaders were austere, highly educated, and incredibly convincing. They were winning the hearts and minds of the people because they were out there doing the actual work.
It was a full-blown crisis of communication and credibility. The church was losing the intellectual and moral battle on the ground because its frontline workers were completely ineffective.
And the physical danger of stepping into that gap was very real. The text shares this wild detail about Dominic's early debates with the Albigenses. At one point, both sides submitted a written summary of their theological arguments.
Yeah, the trial by fire.
Right. The Albigenses decided the best way to test the truth was to subject Dominic's document to a literal trial by fire. They threw his written arguments straight into the flames.
And according to the historical accounts, the flames allegedly spit the document back out, completely untouched, 3 separate times.
3 times. Now, whether you take that as a literal miracle or, a metaphorical legend about his unbreakable arguments, it solidified his reputation in the region.
It definitely put him on the map.
But what really launched his organization wasn't just his personal charisma, it was his radical innovation in how religious life was structured. He looked at the lazy monopoly of the local parish priests and decided to disrupt it entirely.
Because before Dominic, if you wanted to be a serious religious figure like a monk, you went to a monastery, you took a vow of stability, and you stayed put.
You didn't leave.
Never. You prayed, you chanted in the choir, you worked the land, and you simply did not leave the walls of the cloister. Dominic looked at that model and realized it just couldn't solve the crisis in southern France.
Right.
So he fused 2 totally different concepts. He took the strict, contemplative, highly disciplined life of a monk, and he combined it with the mobility of an apostle.
Wait, so they created a rigid religious order, but realized rigid rules would burn out their traveling preachers. How did they actually balance chanting in a choir for hours a day with walking hundreds of miles across France to debate heretics? I mean, you can't be in 2 places at once.
And that structural tension is exactly what could have broken the organization on day 1.
Yeah.
If you enforce the monastic rules strictly, your preachers can't travel. But if you let them travel freely, they lose their monastic discipline. So Dominic solved this by introducing what we call the functional dispensation.
Okay, where did it?
He baked it directly into their constitution that the laws of the order did not bind under sin.
Meaning, if you broke a rule, you weren't damning your soul. Which sounds like a massive relief valve.
It was a revolutionary concept in medieval religious life. Furthermore, Dominic explicitly granted local superiors the power to dispense with the rules entirely.
Really? Just ignore them?
Exactly. If fasting or attending lengthy choir prayers impeded a friar's ability to study for an upcoming debate or travel to preach, the superior could just waive the rule. Wow.
He introduced radical flexibility and subsidiarity, meaning local decision-making, directly into the organizational code. The mission of preaching the truth was the absolute priority. The rules were just tools to serve that mission, and if the tool wasn't working, you put it down.
Because they optimized their rule book for flexibility and education, the organization didn't just grow, it exploded intellectually and geographically.
It really did.
I mean, by 1303, which is barely 80 years after Dominic's death, the order had nearly 600 priories and roughly 12,600 members spread across Europe and beyond.
The numbers are staggering for a medieval institution. And they didn't just build these priories randomly out in the countryside.
No, it's almost like they were building a global franchise of Ivy League research institutes. They strategically placed their houses of study in major university towns.
Places like Paris, Bologna, Oxford.
Exactly. Their product wasn't just quiet theology, it was hard intellectual combat. They were training elite debaters to go out into the world. And what's fascinating here is that they didn't just isolate themselves and study the Bible in a vacuum. The Dominicans actively engaged with the absolute cutting edge and often highly controversial thought of the 13th century.
Right.
You look at their giants of thought men like Albert the Great and Thomas Aquinas.
I mean, Thomas Aquinas is a massive historical figure. Even people who know nothing about medieval theology have usually heard his name.
Absolutely. And what Aquinas did with the full institutional backing of the order was aggressively integrate new knowledge into their curriculum, specifically the philosophy of Aristotle.
Which was a big deal.
A huge deal. We have to understand the context here. Aristotle wasn't a Christian saint. He was a pagan, pre-Christian philosopher whose works were just being rediscovered in the West, largely translated and preserved by Arabic scholars.
Yeah, and a lot of people were scared of that.
Many conservative figures in the church were terrified of Aristotle. They thought his ideas would corrupt Christian theology. But the Dominicans took the stance that truth is truth wherever it is found. Integrating Aristotle was the medieval equivalent of a modern company making a massive, highly controversial pivot to a brand new, untested technology. They synthesized this new knowledge, keeping themselves at the absolute vanguard of European intellectual life.
And they didn't keep that cutting-edge knowledge locked up in the lecture halls of Paris or Oxford either. The geographic reach of these missionaries is just incredible.
Oh, it spanned continents.
The text notes they sent friars out to the Tartars in Asia, to the Cumans in Eastern Europe, and eventually to the New World. You have thinkers like Francis of Vitoria, a Dominican in Spain, who looked at the discovery of the Americas and laid the very foundations for international law.
Right, he was arguing for the fundamental rights of indigenous peoples.
Exactly. They were completely fearless about where they would go and who they would engage.
Though sometimes they were perhaps a little too eager to engage.
Oh, absolutely. There's this hilarious historical anecdote from the text about a Dominican named John of Ragusa. He was at the Council of Basel in the 15th century debating the Hussites. And for a little context, the Hussites were a major pre-Protestant reform movement in Bohemia that basically rebelled against the Catholic Church. So the stakes of this debate are incredibly high.
Very high stakes.
John gets up to the podium and apparently spins out his debate arguments for 8 straight days. 8 continuous days of talking.
I can't even imagine.
It prompted his Hussite opponent to finally quip, "You are indeed of the order of preachers. That is why you talk so much."
It really highlights their sheer endurance and their absolute commitment to verbal persuasion. They built an incredibly robust system designed to out-talk, outthink, and outmaneuver any intellectual opponent.
So they built this incredibly resilient intellectual machine. It seems unstoppable. But looking at the timeline, they hit the mid-1300s. You can have the best organizational structure in the world, but it doesn't matter if you suddenly lose half your workforce.
Yeah.
The robust system Dominic built encountered a massive external shock that completely broke its operational model.
Right. We're talking about the arrival of the Black Death.
The plague.
The bubonic plague decimated Europe, and it absolutely ravaged the Dominican order.
Hinnebusch's text gives these chilling statistics. Entire priories were wiped out in a matter of weeks. In Florence, 80 Dominicans died. In Pisa, 40.
Devastating.
The highly trained, intellectually seasoned men they relied on to preach, teach, and lead the organization were suddenly just gone.
And this triggered a disastrous cascading effect. When you lose your middle management and your senior leaders overnight, it creates an extreme talent crisis.
Yeah.
The order panicked. They looked at their empty priories, and desperate to fill those empty robes and maintain their institutional footprint, they began recruiting immature, uneducated young boys.
And you can't hold a young, unmotivated teenager to the strict, austere lifestyle of a mature, zealous monk.
Precisely. The functional dispensation Dominic created was meant to be used strategically to allow a zealous preacher to study. But to keep these new, unmotivated boys happy and from leaving the order, superiors began issuing wholesale dispensations.
Just giving them out like candy.
Exactly. They waived the fasting rules, they waived the prayer times, just to keep bodies in the buildings.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the text paints this incredibly vivid picture of institutional decay. For you listening, if you've ever seen a scrappy, hungry, pizza the break room startup transform into a bloated, lethargic corporation where executives are fighting over corner offices and private jets, you know exactly what the Dominicans were going through in the 14th and 15th centuries.
It's a perfect parallel.
The original ideal of extreme poverty completely vanished. You had friars who began keeping private incomes from their wealthy families. They stopped wearing the simple, rough wool habits and started wearing custom-tailored robes made of expensive cloth, complete with long trains and rows of buttons.
And buttons were a major luxury item in the Middle Ages.
They were.
They were a pure status symbol. It signaled that you didn't have to do manual labor.
They started building private apartments for themselves within the monasteries so they wouldn't have to sleep in the communal dormitories.
Right.
They skipped the communal dining hall. And at absolute rock bottom, tradesmen were literally wheeling their carts directly into the monastery dining room to sell luxury wares and custom food to the wealthy friars who could afford them.
It's an unbelievable shift from Dominic selling his books to feed the poor.
It really is.
But if we look at the sociology behind this breakdown, it makes perfect sense. Dominic built a system based on a very delicate psychological tension. It required balancing contemplation, the strict, poor, prayerful monastic life, with active ministry going out into the messy world.
Right.
That tension only holds together if the individuals possess immense internal spiritual motivation.
Without that internal fire, the strict rules just feel like a meaningless burden.
Exactly. When the plague wiped out that mature, motivated generation, the tension snapped. The system devolved into what the text calls the private life.
The private life.
Yes. It became a comfortable, highly bureaucratic existence. The institution essentially became a victim of its own earlier success and the massive wealth it had accumulated from benefactors who admired the previous generation.
So how do you fix a massive 400-year-old broken institution? You attempt to force a reboot to the original code.
You try to, at least.
And this leads us into the intense reform wars within the order. You had a bitter civil war that dragged on for decades between
Yeah.
two factions, the observants and the conventuals.
Right. The observants were the reformers. They wanted to return strictly to the original observance of Dominic's rules, the extreme poverty, the fasting, the harsh discipline.
To conventuals?
The conventuals were the ones who had grown accustomed to their private apartments, their buttons, and their fixed incomes, and they wanted to maintain that comfortable status quo.
The mechanics of how they fought this internal war are fascinating. They didn't just hold polite committee meetings. How did an observant faction actually take over a lax conventual priory?
It was essentially a medieval, corporate, hostile takeover. Yeah. The observants, led by intense figures like Raymond of Capua and later Girolamo Savonarola, fought tooth and nail to reclaim individual houses. They would essentially lobby the Pope or a powerful local king for the legal right to reform a specific priory.
Okay.
Once they had the decree, a squad of these ultra-strict observant friars would literally march in, take over the leadership positions, and enforce the old rules.
And if the lax friars push back?
If the conventual friars refused to comply, they were expelled or forced to flee to a different unreformed house. It was incredibly messy, highly political, and fractured the order's unity for over a century.
But looking at this from a wider angle, I'm looking at their foundational mandate, this obsession with protecting the truth at all costs. When you combine an army of highly educated, legally trained debaters with absolute moral certainty, that seems like a recipe for weaponizing their intellect against anyone who disagrees with them.
Yeah, it does.
During this same era, didn't that intense intellectual zeal have an incredibly dark side?
That is a crucial historical point, and the text addresses it impartially. That same intellectual rigor did lead to some undeniably dark chapters.
Right.
Because the Dominicans were the highly trained intellectual lawyers of the Church, the papacy specifically tasked them with staffing the medieval Inquisition.
Oh, wow.
They were given the mandate to root out heresy, which resulted in the imprisonment, torture, and execution of those deemed threats to orthodox truth.
The text specifically mentions the Malleus Maleficarum, the hammer of witches.
Yes. Written by two Dominicans, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, in the late 15th century. It became the definitive best-selling textbook on how to identify, interrogate, and prosecute sorcery and witchcraft.
That's intense.
It's a stark example of what happens when the mandate to protect ideological purity collides with the mass paranoia and hysteria of an era. The sophisticated intellectual tools designed by Aquinas to debate theology were turned toward prosecuting supposed witches. It is the tragic, terrifying extreme of their foundational mission.
It's a heavy reminder for any modern institution of how organizational expertise can be entirely weaponized when the internal compass shifts.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the order eventually realized it couldn't just live in the 13th century anymore.
Right.
By the late 15th century, Pope Sixtus V looked at the reality of their massive universities and libraries and practically forced the order to formally accept property ownership.
It's just pragmatism.
He essentially told them that the era of wandering, penniless beggars was over. To run a global educational footprint, you need fixed, reliable incomes.
So they finally updated their operating system to match reality. But just as they were stabilizing these internal reform wars, an entirely new, massive external threat emerged in the 18th century absolute monarchy.
The rise of the modern centralized state.
The text talks about these enlightened despots, which is such a fantastic historical phrase. Specifically, we have Emperor Joseph II of Austria.
Oh.
They literally dubbed him the sacristan emperor. The state became so absurdly powerful and centralized that it decided it didn't just want to control taxes and standing armies. It wanted to micromanage the internal operations of international religious orders.
Because the state viewed global institutions like the Dominicans as a direct threat to national sovereignty.
Right.
They didn't want their citizens answering to a master general in Rome, so they began aggressively dismantling them.
And the mechanics of this state takeover are wild. Emperor Joseph II was unilaterally shutting down any monastery he didn't deem socially useful.
Useful according to the state.
Exactly. If you weren't running a hospital or a local school, the state confiscated your property. And the micromanagement went all the way down to the granular.
Oh, it was extreme.
You have secular middle managers and bureaucrats dictating internal religious life. The Emperor of Austria was literally prescribing the exact number of candles that the friars were legally allowed to burn during their church services.
Think about the psychological impact of that on the organization. It represents the ultimate loss of institutional autonomy.
Yeah.
The agile, disruptive, fearless startup of the 13th century that used to walk hundreds of miles to debate heretics was now being dictated to by state accountants about their candle budget.
It's absurd.
They survived the plagues and the internal civil wars, only to be nearly suffocated by the bureaucratic red tape of the modern nation-state.
So what does this all mean? For you, the listener, navigating your own career or watching modern companies rise and fall, why does this 600-year history matter?
It's a great question.
It matters because the story of the Dominicans is a masterclass in the life cycle of any great organization. It always starts with a visionary founder solving a very real problem. It scales through brilliant structural innovation like the functional dispensation, allowing for subsidiarity and absolute intellectual fearlessness. But then, inevitably, it rots from within due to complacency, the accumulation of wealth, and devastating external shocks. And from that low point, the institution has to constantly fight to reform itself, clawing back its identity while pushing back against the encroaching, micromanaging power of the state.
And exploring that life cycle brings up one final thought for you to mull over. Throughout their sweeping history, the Dominicans had to continually rewrite their own operational rules to survive.
Right.
They eventually allowed property ownership, they fundamentally changed their study habits, they updated their curriculum to include once forbidden philosophers, and they yielded to the demands of secular kings. At what point does a massive institution stop being its original self and instead become something entirely new that is merely wearing the uniform and the branding of the past?
That's a deep question.
It's a profound question of identity that every enduring organization eventually has to answer.
It's the ultimate institutional ship of Theseus. If you replace every plank over 600 years, is it still the same ship? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the history behind the massive institutions that shape our world today. And remember, sometimes the most profound, world-changing innovations start with a single, all-night debate.